Good morning. It's a wonderful event that Michael Hawley has put together, and I must congratulate him for his excellent organization. My name is Pashaura Singh. I'm a professor at the University of California, Riverside. So I'm going to introduce you the keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is Professor Hugh Johnston. He's a professor emeritus in the field of history at Simon Fraser University. He has a number of publications. Some are The Voyage of the Komagata Maru, The Sikh Challenge to Canada's Color Bar. Second one is Jewels of the Killa, the remarkable story of an Indo-Canadian family. Another publication is with Tara Singh Bands, The Four Quarters of the Night, the life journey of an immigrant Sikh. I remember reviewing this book a long time back in 1995, I think. Today, Professor Johnston is going to speak on the many sides of Komagata Maru as seen through individual stories. Professor Hugh Johnston is the foremost Canadian authority on the Komagata Maru. He is the Voyage of the Komagata Maru, the Sikh Challenge to the Canada's Color Bar, is a classic in the field and must reading for anyone interested in this significant historical event. The book has become thoroughly revised, updated, and expanded for this centenary year. And it is also available outside. And if anyone wants to buy this book, it's available. So please welcome Professor Hugh Johnston.
Thank you, Pashaura. And it's a delight and a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the audience that has turned out. Always takes an effort, and we don't have an occasion if people don't make that effort. I appreciate it. I have a question about the lighting. Is there anyone here who controls it? Because I would prefer more lighting on the audience. Is that possible? Okay, great. I want to be able to see your faces. I'll explain my paper by referring to a novel that was very popular at the time, and it continues right to the moment. And I must have read within a few years of it appearing in 1955, The Bridge of Saint Louis Ray. And the subject of the novel is the inspiration for the novel was the actual collapse of an Inca grass-woven bridge in Peru. And there were 5 travelers who went down into the gorge with the bridge. And the novelist made an exploration of the lives of 5 fictional people. The question is, what brought them to that spot at that moment that brought their lives to an end simultaneously? And most of them were strangers. The larger subject was whether or not there was a greater plan. And that involved questions of good and evil and what had happened in their lives previously that brought them there. So that is a book with a deep philosophical meaning. And I can't excuse exactly the comparison, but I am thinking of lives brought together in 1914 and a common experience, and for many, a tragic experience. But the lives brought together were not simply the lives of the men on the ship that was turned back. I'm presuming that people have some outline of this story in their minds. Tell me if I need to explain more than I am. But not simply, I'm thinking not just of the lives of the people on the ship, but the lives of everybody who had some communication, business, action related to the ship. You could put it in simple terms. In 1914, there was a confrontation between a ship with 376 passengers from Punjab and the city of Vancouver. The citizens of Vancouver stood in confrontation with that ship. And so we can be talking about those citizens. Now, those citizens of Vancouver included Punjabis. So they had a very interesting relationship to the whole story. They were supporters of the men on the ship and living in the midst of that city. And so that's the sort of idea, to give you a number of lives. And I said in my brief outline, I actually wanted to, I didn't use the word stereotypical, but by looking at many lives, one can get away from a stereotypical notion of experience of a group of people, because everyone is an individual and everyone has a different history and actually a different understanding of what's happening to them right then. Now what I offer is suggestive. Many people have tackled this story and given it very serious thought, and quite a number of people have thought of how do you tell this story fictionally? And there are ways in which fiction can go beyond a researched account. I should say that fiction needs to be researched. Good fiction needs to be researched. But when you are limiting yourself to what you can demonstrate in the record, there are some gaps you can't fill in. You can speculate about them, but you can't fill them in. In fiction, you can. And I would like, with these few stories, to suggest that there is a richness in this experience of the city and the ship that goes beyond probably what you can imagine from the bare bones of the story. So if you're going to do a fictional account of it, I'm thinking don't just take the bare outline of the story and start inventing characters. Read more, ask more, get to know more, and then imagine better. So I picked out 12 people, and then I realized I can't do that, and I shortened it to about 6 or so. And I will start off with the Mayor of Vancouver in 1914. He lasted as mayor for 2 years. And he's of particular interest to me. I'm not paid that much attention to him, but I have a connection. His name was Baxter. Truman Smith Baxter. And the connection that I have is that he came from a farm in southern Ontario that was a mile from the one-room schoolhouse I attended as a boy. So then I can imagine who he is. Actually, I grew up in the neighborhood from which he came, now, many years before. But I know those people. And it's a prosperous farming neighborhood of generally good-hearted people. When I was there, people had inevitably left because the farm could only support one son. So others go and daughters go, some further, some closer. But what you have left behind are people who are really doing quite well, who haven't traveled anywhere, who have very few books in their houses other than things that are immensely practical. And I don't think it could have been so different back in the generation when Truman Smith Baxter left. I can tell you exactly where his father's 50-acre farm was. I can put it precisely on the map. And he left. He left when he was a very young man. Now, he left a neighborhood that at that point was half a century old. In other words, a matter of 2 to 3 generations of people. They were all of Scots, Irish, West Country English, and German ancestry. Now, if there were tensions there between these groups, they were primarily tensions between Catholics and Protestants. Those people, and I can speak of the later generation that I knew, could tell you very little about India. You know, it had not come into their world. Very little about Indians. Nothing about Indian religions. Nothing sensible. They just wouldn't. They wouldn't go into any discussion of it. I mean, that wasn't part of their world. And so that's where Truman Smith Baxter grew up, and then he came west. And he would be, like so many people coming west, a person on the make. I mean, you come west, well, for adventure. And that's, I'm going to include almost everyone who was here there. They came for adventure, and they came to get ahead. And he did get ahead. He started teaching a primary school, and then he actually educated himself as a lawyer, and he went into business, and he had a furniture store. And he would belong to the business elite of the city. He was one of the, I was going to use the word rabid, I'll say strong anti-Asian spokespeople. His name will come up if you make a close study of the Komagata Maru as the organizer of a great mass meeting in Vancouver of protest against the Komagata Maru and against letting those people in. So the question for me is, with my connection with Truman Smith Baxter, where did that come from? Until you came to Vancouver, you'd never met anybody from Asia. It's not as a deep experience that you've had with anybody. Where did that negativity come from? And I'll leave it there. I'll go on to a parallel character. And now, Truman Smith Baxter, you'll have to work hard to find his name in any account, but he was there. I want to speak about H.H. Stevens, because if you make any study of the Komagata Maru, you're going to encounter his name. And he was not simply an anti-Asian person. He was the leading speaker, and he goes down in history with some amazing statements. One was during the episode of the Komagata Maru at a public meeting in Vancouver. He said something to this effect: I defy you to name one positive thing that Indian civilization has done for the rest of the world. So, strong statement. Who was this guy? Well, he also had come from Ontario. He had come from east of Toronto up against the Canadian Shield territory. He was actually born in Bristol, England, and then he came as a boy with his parents. And they were not well-to-do immigrants. They were struggling immigrants. And his early experience would have been exactly that. And then the family moved to British Columbia, to the Okanagan, to Vernon. And when he was a teenager, then he started working in a grocery store, and he did jobs. He worked for the railway and things like that. He got to Vancouver. He turned himself into an accountant. He became a businessman. He became a politician. He was a very strong personality. And he was a force in Vancouver as a political personality for more than 30 years. Matter of fact, in the 1930s, when he had been in the Progressive Conservative cabinet, in 1935, he started his own party, a third party, the Reconstruction Party, and it effectively torpedoed the chances of the Conservatives. So the Liberals came in. I'm just suggesting someone of a strong personality and a very prominent voice in British Columbia. And he was very energetically opposed to Asian immigration. And where did that come from? Now, I can give you a better answer than I did for Truman Smith. Baxter. When he was living in British Columbia as a very young man, about 22, he went down to Seattle and he joined an American auxiliary force that went in support of American troops in China during what was known as the Boxer Rebellion. I mean, I just tell you this, and I'm thinking things are not different. I mean, we're going off to other parts of the world and straightening people out. And that's what was happening then, and he went in support of that force. Now, what had he seen up till then? Well, he'd seen Peterborough, Ontario, and he'd seen Vernon, BC, and then he'd been down to Seattle, and then he was in Asia. And he was in Tianjin, which is up the coast. That's a very vague way of describing it, but... And actually, at one point, he was responsible for organizing a convoy of a huge amount of silver from the Chinese imperial treasury that the Americans had appropriated to pay for their expenses of going there and fixing up the Chinese. But what he saw during the year in China appalled him. He had no idea that there could be so many people in a country. And they were so different. And he came back here and he was oppressed by the notion that those huge numbers of people could come to British Columbia. So he became a very energetic opponent to Asian immigration. And got himself elected first as an alderman and then to the parliament. And this was only 3 years before the Komagata Maru. And in his maiden speech, his topic was Asian immigration. So just a central concern for him. He was also very active in his church, which was the Methodist Church, which many of you will know originated as an evangelical movement within the Anglican Church. Only It was a church that was strong in the industrial cities of Britain and among working class people. He was a lay preacher in that church. His family was immensely important to him. His church and faith was. And he preached frequently here in Vancouver, and he went out into the interior of British Columbia from time to time, and he preached. So there's a man of a commitment in a number of directions. He's not a man drifting through life. He's a man who cares. And he may not care always in the way you do, but he cares immensely. And he was very central during the Komagata Maru. He had tremendous influence by force of personality, by the fact that he was a conservative member of Parliament, connected to the government in Ottawa. He had tremendous influence over the immigration office and the immigration agent here in Vancouver. So people can now go into the Vancouver City Archives and they can find Stephen's papers. And there's all kinds of material there that perhaps rightly shouldn't be there, because the immigration agent was copying to him department correspondence, everything that he would be interested in, and that had to do with Asian immigration. So there's a certain percentage of the immigration files that ended up in copies in his possession. Just one last note on him. He lived a long life, a long and very active life, and into his 90s, into his mid-90s. About a year or two before he died, a scholar-writer, a researcher-writer from India, his name was Mutana, Mutana, who wrote a book on South Asians in North America, in Canada specifically, and he interviewed Stephens. And what caught my attention at one point was the tribute in the front of the book from this Indian scholar to Stephens, and thanking him for so graciously receiving him in his own home and entertaining him when he came for the interview. And I offer this only, if you're a storyteller at some point and trying to convey all of this, and you're wanting to get the roundness of it, that's one thing to throw into the barrel. Now I have a passenger to talk about, and we talk about those who landed. I mean, there were the 20 who had been in Canada before who were landed. And then there were, I have to do my math, but roughly 350 who were not allowed to land. There was one man who died in Vancouver, and his name was Singh. Now, the first time I wrote about this, I just mentioned a passenger. I didn't actually know his name. But then I took the trouble recently to track it down. And he was a man of about, I think, 27. He had worked in Hong Kong. He came from what's called the Doaba area of Punjab, where so many Punjabi Sikh immigrants to Canada over the years have originated. He actually, though, came from a princely state called Kapurthala, and he came from the central town in that state. So that much we know about him. I know his name of his father and his mother. They're on his death certificate. I know that he was visited in hospital by a local Sikh named Kartar Singh, but I don't know which of the Kartar Singhs it may have been. But what happened is the Komagata Maru arrived in Burrard Inlet, and within days, he was taken off the ship, and he was taken into Vancouver General Hospital. The wing of the hospital in which he was kept still stands. It's still there. It's buried within the whole hospital complex. And he died there within a week. He was taken off because he was suffering an obviously acute attack of asthma. But the doctor on his death certificate noted that the underlying cause was tuberculosis. And now I look at the bottom of the death certificate and I see that the doctor's name was Monroe. And that makes sense. Monroe was an immigration doctor. He had been with the immigration department for a long time. He was Scots-born but raised in Canada. And if you look at Dr. Monroe's his life, you realize that he probably was an outstanding member of the medical profession. You might not assume that the immigration doctor was, but he did postgraduate studies repeatedly to keep himself up to date over the years, and so in the United States and in Europe. There's a long list of places where he studied. It takes you to many centers in the United States and to several in Europe. He was at one point president of the Medical Association in Vancouver. He was at one point in his later life president of the Medical Association of British Columbia, and he was at one point president of the Medical Association of Canada. So I think I'm drawing from that he was respected by his colleagues in the medical profession. He was very active. But he was the immigration doctor in 1914. He had been for some time, and he continued to be for some time afterwards. And he's worth noticing because for one period in 1908, he had to stand in as the immigration agent. This was when I'm getting too enthusiastic. He was there on the spot when the continuous passage rule was first applied. And for those of you who may not know, I think most of you do, that was the device by which Canada, the principal device by which Canada kept immigrants from India out of the country. And it was not used against immigrants from India until that spring. Dr. Monroe met a ship, the Monteagle, and there were 186, among the passengers, 186 Punjabis. And he processed them in the normal way. And he was proceeding to land most of them. I mean, those who were ill or showed signs of a disease that would disqualify them, he would stop. But he was landing most of them. And he was communicating with Ottawa, because a ship with a lot of Punjabis on it at that point was something that Ottawa was paying attention to. He was in the midst of this, and he was instructed not to land any of them and to use the continuous passage provision. Now, that provision had existed for use against Japanese immigrants, very specifically to stop Japanese immigrants coming from Hawaii. Because the Japanese government had agreed to control immigration from Japan, but they said we can't do anything about people who are of Japanese nationalities who are in Hawaii who come on to Vancouver. So Canada had drafted this continuous passage provision. It came into effect that January, and now in March, Dr. Munro was told, use that against these Punjabis. And so he did. Now there was, how am I for time?
Still 5 more minutes.
Okay, so I'm not going to get through my people. There was, at that time, a correspondent for the London Times in Vancouver, and his name was L.W. Crippen. He was the theatre critic based in New York for the London Times. But he was in Vancouver because he was going with the proprietor of the Times on a North American tour. And they ended up in Vancouver just at the moment that this business was happening with the passengers on the Montego. And Crippen wrote a fairly long story which went back to London about this. He was appalled by what he was seeing. And he described Munro as a very kindly man. A very kindly man struggling to do what his instructions were. And there's a rather interesting sentence at the end of that story, submitted to the Times. What will be the legacy of this in Vancouver and British Columbia? What will the legacy be for the British Empire? And my time may be close up. Is it?
Complete your story.
Well, I mean, what I've given you is a sequence from this Singh who came and who died in hospital in Vancouver, but it's given me an excuse to talk to you about Dr. Munro and the introduction of this use of the continuous passage provision to stop immigrants from India. I've got more on my list, so I can go on if the chair allows me. So who do I have next? Well, and again, I'm telling these stories to encourage anyone with a creative urge to go and research before inventing. Because what you can invent frequently is much paler than the reality you're trying to get at. So the person I want to speak about now is Muncha Singh Sheen. And he was one of the earliest immigrants. He came about 1903. He was here for everything. He's not a prominent name. You can find him at one point as president, this is in the 1930s, late 1920s, as president of the Sikh Gurdwara Society in Vancouver, the Khalsa Diwan Society. So you can find him there. But his is a story to keep in mind. The Sikhs built a temple. Most people will know that simple statement. And they built it very early on. The committee that was building the temple started the planning in the summer of 1906. There were 2 big years in which Punjabi Sikhs arrived. And they were 1906 and 1907. And in the midst of that first year, Sikhs were already planning a temple. And they had a committee. The committee was out raising money. They had a property. They were looking at plans. And they had it done by 1908. The first wedding performed in that temple, which is the first Sikh temple in Vancouver, the first Sikh temple in Canada, the first Sikh temple in North America. The first wedding performed there had Munshi Singh Sheen as the groom and Annie Wright as the bride. The wedding was conducted by a very highly educated and spiritual leader in the Sikh community. His name was Teja Singh. And the local Sikhs had brought him there in order to give their community some leadership, some direction, both in dealing with the Canadian government and the local Canadian authorities, but also spiritual direction. And he was officiating at that. He wrote up the report on that wedding, Teja Singh. And if you look through the Vancouver papers, you'll find an article by Teja Singh. And he looks to a future of interracial marriage. But he was as good as his word, because the very first wedding in the Sikh temple in Vancouver was between a Sikh and a white woman. Munshi Singh and Annie Wright had, up till 1921 or 23, as a married couple, and she died. She was a little older than he was. She's described in the papers as an attractive woman. By the way, there was not only a wedding in the Sikh Gurdwara, but there was a wedding in the Anglican Church. Actually, there were 2 weddings in the Anglican Church, so the family still can't figure out why that second wedding took place a little later. I have some of this information from Munshi Singh's grandson. So he's living in the Vancouver area now, and he's gone digging back to try and find out his roots. He is 1/4 Punjabi and 3/4 white. But he's gone back. He's not even sure what village Munshi Singh came from. The family told one story, but he went back there and the villagers didn't know anything about it. He's not sure, and Munshi Singh didn't keep that stuff. So after he's gone, if you haven't asked him before, you don't know now. But there was Munshi Singh in Vancouver from 1903 right through. He lived a good long life. He saw it all. He was there as a part of the community through all the struggles of the early years. Actually, his grandson wrote a piece in the paper quite a number of years ago, an affectionate piece about his grandfather, but he did describe seeing people, rudeness towards him on the buses and, you know, name calling and that sort of thing. The grandson looks like a white kid. The grandfather looks like a Punjabi entirely. How am I doing?
Thank you.